She walked into the nursing home smiling and dropped her purse the moment she saw him. Standing there, holding yellow daisies, was the black man she left at the hospital 40 years ago. Her voice cracked. "Is this real?" He looked her in the eye and whispered, "I just wanted to know why. Where are you listening from today? Take a breath and feel this one." The white envelope trembled in Steve Larson's hands as he stood outside the Pinewood nursing home. At 40 years old, with salt and pepper hair cropping up around his temples and worry lines etched across his forehead, he had built a successful life as a cardiac surgeon in Boston. Yet here he was, clutching a bouquet of yellow daisies and a letter that had turned his world upside down just 3 weeks ago. "Are you sure you want to do this?" His wife Julia's voice came through the phone, pressed against his ear. After everything she did, or didn't do. Steve took a deep breath, watching an elderly couple shuffle through the nursing home's entrance doors. "I need answers, Julia. I've spent my whole life wondering." The letter had come unexpectedly, forwarded from the adoption agency that had placed him with the Larson family 4 decades ago. His birth mother was dying and had asked to see him one last time. Her name was Elizabeth Cleaver, a name that had haunted the empty spaces of Steve's childhood dreams. "You don't owe her anything," Julia reminded him gently. "I know," Steve replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But maybe I owe it to myself." The fact was simple but devastating. A white woman had given birth to a mixed-race baby in 1985 and left him at the hospital without so much as a name. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a signature on a form relinquishing her parental rights. Now, 40 years later, she wanted to see him. Steve ended the call and pocketed his phone. The daisies seemed to weigh 100 pounds in his grip. He'd chosen them not knowing what flowers Elizabeth might like, if she liked flowers at all. He knew nothing about the woman who had given him life and then disappeared. Inside the nursing home, the antiseptic smell hit him immediately, mingling with the sense of cafeteria food and industrial cleaner. The receptionist smiled professionally as he approached. "I'm here to see Elizabeth Cleaver," he said, his doctor's composure taking over. "Oh yes, she mentioned she was expecting someone today. Room 217, down that hallway and to the left." As Steve walked down the corridor, memories of his childhood flooded back. The Larsons had been wonderful adoptive parents, loving, supportive, honest. They'd told him early on that he was adopted, answering his questions as best they could. But some questions had no answers. "Why didn't she want me?" he'd asked his adoptive mother when he was 7, after being teased at school about his skin color not matching his parents'. "Sometimes people aren't ready to be parents," she'd answered, holding him close. "It doesn't mean there was anything wrong with you. It just means she wasn't ready." But that explanation had never been enough, especially when he'd learned his birth mother had gone on to marry and have 2 other children, white children she'd kept and raised. Room 217 loomed before him now, the door partially open. Steve paused, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the crack, he could see a thin, white-haired woman in a bed, her face turned toward the window. She looked small, fragile, nothing like the monster he'd sometimes imagined in his darkest moments. He knocked softly. "Come in," a weak voice called. Taking a deep breath, Steve pushed the door open. The woman turned, her pale blue eyes widening as they landed on him. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something else. Shame? Fear? He couldn't tell. "Steve," she whispered, his name foreign on her lips. "You came." He stood frozen in the doorway, suddenly unsure of what to say to the stranger who had carried him for 9 months, and then decided he wasn't worth keeping. "Hello, Elizabeth," he finally managed, his voice more controlled than he felt. He held up the daisies awkwardly. "I brought these." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down cheeks mapped with wrinkles and age spots. "They're beautiful," she said. "They were always my favorite." A coincidence that stung with its intimacy. How could he have known? Steve placed the flowers on the side table and remained standing, unwilling to sit, to settle into this moment that felt both too real and utterly surreal. "Thank you for coming," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. I didn't think you would. I almost didn't, he admitted. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, 40 years wide. You look so much like him, she finally said. Like who? Your father. The words hit Steve like a physical blow. In all his wondering about his birth mother, he'd given less thought to the man who'd contributed to his existence. You kept in touch with him? Steve asked, a new hurt blossoming. Elizabeth shook her head, looking down at her gnarled hands. No, but I never forgot his face. She paused, seeming to gather courage. There's something I need to tell you, Steve. Something I should have told you years ago. The reason I gave you up wasn't what you probably think. Steve felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Then what was it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty clear. You didn't want a mixed-race baby in your white world. No, Elizabeth whispered, her voice suddenly urgent. That's not it at all. I loved you from the moment I knew I was pregnant. I wanted to keep you more than anything. Then why didn't you? Steve demanded, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. Elizabeth's eyes darted to the door, as if checking that they were alone. When she looked back at him, there was fear in her expression, raw and real. Because your father threatened to kill us both if I did. Steve felt the room spin around him. Threatened to kill you both? The words came out barely above a whisper as he finally sank into the chair beside Elizabeth's bed, his legs no longer able to support him. Elizabeth nodded, her thin fingers plucking nervously at the bedsheet. His name was Donald McCarthy. He was a police officer in our town. She paused, her gaze distant as if looking back through time. I was 22, working as a waitress at a diner. He would come in during his shifts, always sitting in my section. He was charming, good-looking. When he asked me out, I was flattered. Steve listened, trying to reconcile this story with the narrative he'd constructed in his head over decades. We dated for a few months, Elizabeth continued. Then I found out I was pregnant with you. When I told him, everything changed. He became different, angry, said it would ruin his career, his reputation. Her voice grew quieter. He was married, you see. Had a whole other family I knew nothing about. He was married? Steve echoed, trying to process this new information. Elizabeth nodded, shame coloring her pale cheeks. I didn't know until after I told him about the pregnancy. He admitted it then, said his wife could never find out. But that wasn't the worst part. She took a shaky breath. When he realized you would be, that your skin wouldn't be white, he became dangerous. Said no one could ever know the baby was his. Steve felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. What did he do? At first he tried to make me get an abortion. When I refused, he threatened me. Said he could make me disappear, that no one would question a police officer's word against a waitress who'd gotten herself in trouble. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. One night, he broke into my apartment, put his gun to my stomach where you were growing, and told me if I didn't get rid of you, he'd do it himself. Steve closed his eyes, his doctor's mind conjuring unwanted images of what could have happened. Why didn't you report him? Go to someone for help? He was respected in the community. His brother was the police chief. His father-in-law was a judge. Elizabeth's voice was hollow with old fear. I tried once, went to another officer. The next day, Donald showed up at my door, told me he knew exactly what I'd done, and that next time, he wouldn't just threaten. Steve opened his eyes, studying the fragile woman before him. Was this the truth, or an elaborate fiction designed to absolve her of abandoning her child? So you decided to give me up, he said, his tone neutral, clinical, the same tone he used when delivering difficult news to patients. Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I couldn't keep you safe. I couldn't protect you from him. The only way to save you was to make sure he believed you were gone. I arranged a private adoption through a church organization, told them I wanted no records that could trace back to me. Her hands trembled as she reached for a tissue. I left town right after you were born, moved 3 states away. I was so afraid he'd find out somehow, that he'd come after us both. And then you started another family, Steve said, unable to keep the hurt from his voice. You had other children. Elizabeth's face crumpled. 5 years later, I met Jerry Cleaver. He was kind, gentle, everything Donald wasn't. We married, had 2 daughters. She looked up at Steve, her eyes pleading for understanding. I never stopped thinking about you. Every birthday, every Christmas, I wondered where you were, if you were happy, if you were safe. Steve stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, residents in wheelchairs were being pushed around a garden path by attendants. Normal lives, simple moments. He'd built his own version of normal, a successful career, a loving wife, 2 teenage sons. But underneath had always been this void, this question mark. Why now? He asked, his back still to Elizabeth. After 40 years, why reach out now? The silence stretched so long that Steve finally turned around. Elizabeth was staring at her hands, now folded in her lap. I'm dying, she said simply. Cancer, it's spread everywhere. The doctors give me a month, maybe 2. She looked up at him. I couldn't die without trying to find you, without telling you the truth. I know it doesn't change anything, doesn't make up for what you lost. But I wanted you to know, it wasn't because I didn't love you. Steve felt tears pricking at his eyes and blinked them away. What happened to him? To Donald? He died 20 years ago. Car accident. Elizabeth's expression was unreadable. I only found out because his obituary mentioned he'd been on the force for 30 years. Decorated officer, beloved husband and father, pillar of the community. Her voice held a trace of bitterness. Steve returned to the chair, processing everything he'd heard. If what she was saying was true, she hadn't abandoned him out of rejection or racism, but out of desperate protection. It didn't erase the 40 years of absence, but it painted them in a different light. I have questions, he said. So many questions. I know, Elizabeth replied. I'll answer everything I can, for as long as I have left. Steve hesitated, then pulled out his wallet. He extracted a photo and handed it to Elizabeth. It showed him with Julia, a beautiful woman with deep brown skin and a radiant smile, and their 2 teenage sons, both with skin a shade between their parents. My family, he said. My wife Julia is a pediatrician. We met in medical school. Our boys are Gregory and Jimmy, 16 and 14. Elizabeth's hands shook as she took the photo, tears once again filling her eyes. They're beautiful, she whispered. You have a beautiful family. She looked up at him. You became a doctor? Steve nodded. Cardiac surgeon. Pride flickered across Elizabeth's face. And you had a good family? The people who adopted you? The Larsons, Steve supplied. Yes, they were wonderful parents. Still are. They taught me that family is about love, not blood. Elizabeth nodded, returning the photo. I'm glad. That's what I prayed for every night. That you'd find love. That you'd be happy. For the first time, Steve felt the hard shell around his heart begin to crack. There was still anger there, still hurt. But beneath it, something else was emerging. A complicated compassion for this woman who claimed she'd made an impossible choice. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said honestly. I don't know if that's even what you're asking for. I'm not, Elizabeth replied. I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you. Steve checked his watch. I need to go. I have patients this afternoon. He stood up, gathering his coat. I'll think about everything you've told me. Elizabeth nodded, resignation and understanding in her expression. Thank you for coming, Steve. It means more than you know. As he reached the door, her voice stopped him. Steve, there's something else you should know. Her tone had changed, an urgency entering it that made him turn back. You have sisters, 2 of them, and I never told them about you. Steve froze. They don't know I exist? No, Elizabeth admitted. Jerry knew, but we never told the girls. They're in their 30s now. Catherine lives here in town. She's the one who helped me move into this place. Norma lives in Chicago with her husband and children. Your daughters visit you regularly? Steve asked, a new kind of pain blooming inside him. Catherine comes every Wednesday and Sunday. Norma flies in once a month. Elizabeth hesitated. Catherine is coming tomorrow. The implication hung in the air between them. Steve felt his heart rate increase. What are you asking me? He said, though he already knew. Elizabeth's eyes were both afraid and determined. Would you consider meeting her? Meeting them both? Before Steve could respond, Elizabeth reached for the drawer of her bedside table, pulling out a faded envelope. There's something else I've kept all these years. Something I think you should see. As she extended the envelope toward him with trembling fingers, Steve saw what was written on the front in faded blue ink. For my son, when I find you again. Steve stood in the hallway outside Elizabeth's room, the envelope clutched in his hand, unopened. He had promised to read it later, needing time to process everything he'd learned. Now, sitting in his car in the nursing home parking lot, he stared at his name written in a younger Elizabeth's handwriting. His phone rang, startling him. Julia's name flashed on the screen. How did it go? She asked when he answered, her voice gentle with concern. Steve took a deep breath. It was not what I expected. He summarized Elizabeth's story, the police officer father, the threats, the fear that had driven her to give him up. Do you believe her? Julia asked after a moment of silence. I don't know, Steve admitted, running a hand over his face. Part of me wants to. It would be easier than believing she simply didn't want a black child. But another part wonders if this is just a convenient story she created to ease her conscience before she dies. What does your gut tell you? Steve thought about Elizabeth's eyes as she'd told her story, the way her hands had trembled, the raw emotion in her voice. That she's telling the truth, or at least her version of it. And she wants you to meet your half-sisters? Yes. The oldest one is coming tomorrow. Steve looked down at the envelope. She also gave me a letter she says she wrote years ago in case she ever found me. Are you going to read it? Steve tapped the envelope against the steering wheel. I think I need to, but not yet. After ending the call, he drove home, the letter sitting on the passenger seat like a time bomb. At home, he placed it on his desk, then went to check on his sons. Gregory was doing homework, headphones on, nodding to music only he could hear. Jimmy was sprawled on his bed, reading a novel for English class. Hey, Dad, Jimmy said, looking up. How was your day? Such a simple question, with such a complicated answer. Interesting, Steve replied. I'll tell you about it later. After dinner, with Julia taking the boys to basketball practice, Steve finally sat down at his desk and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, the paper creased from being folded for decades. My dearest son, if you're reading this, it means I've found the courage to look for you, and by some miracle, you've agreed to meet me. I'm writing this letter 2 days after leaving you at the hospital. My arms feel empty. My heart feels broken. But I want you to know that letting you go was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I did it because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. I don't know what your life will be like, who will raise you, what name they'll give you. I pray every night that you'll find a family who loves you completely, who will protect you, and nurture all the gifts I know you'll have. I pray they'll be better parents than I could be right now. Someday, if we meet again, you might ask me why I didn't fight harder, why I didn't find another way. The truth is, I was young and terrified, with no family to help me and nowhere to turn. But that doesn't change the fact that I failed you in the most fundamental way a mother can fail her child. For that, I will never forgive myself. I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, you will always be my first child, my first love. I will think of you every day of my life and hope that somehow you can feel that love across whatever distance separates us. With all my heart. Your mother Steve read the letter twice, then set it down, tears streaming down his face. The raw emotion in Elizabeth's words reached across 40 years to touch something deep inside him. The letter hadn't been written for anyone else's eyes. It held the unfiltered grief of a young mother who believed she had no choice but to give up her child. He thought about his own sons, trying to imagine a scenario where he would give them up. Only the most desperate circumstances could force such a choice. Was that what Elizabeth had faced? A choice between keeping him and risking both their lives, or giving him up and ensuring his safety? The next morning, Steve called the hospital and rearranged his schedule. Then he texted Julia, "Going back to see Elizabeth today. Her daughter will be there." An hour later, he was back at Pinewood Nursing Home, approaching room 217 with a fresh bouquet of daisies. As he neared the door, he heard voices inside. Elizabeth's thin, reedy tone, and another woman's voice, warm and animated. Steve hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Was he ready to meet a sister he never knew existed? A woman who shared his blood, but had no idea he existed until, presumably, today. Before he could decide, the door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her mid-30s, with Elizabeth's blue eyes and wavy brown hair pulled into a neat ponytail. She stopped short when she saw Steve standing there. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know someone was waiting." She smiled apologetically. "Are you looking for my mother's room?" Steve found himself unable to speak for a moment, staring at features that echoed his own in subtle ways, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jawline. "Actually," he finally managed, "I'm here to see Elizabeth." He held up the daisies awkwardly. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize Mom had other visitors. Are you from her church group?" Before Steve could answer, Elizabeth's voice called from inside the room. "Catherine, who's there?" Catherine glanced back into the room, then at Steve again, curiosity evident in her expression. "Someone with flowers, Mom. A gentleman I haven't met." There was a pause, then Elizabeth's voice, suddenly tight with emotion. "Catherine, please ask him to come in." Catherine stepped aside, gesturing for Steve to enter. He walked past her into the room, feeling her curious gaze on his back. Elizabeth was sitting up in bed, looking marginally better than the day before. Her thin hair had been brushed, and someone, Catherine presumably, had applied a touch of pink lipstick to her pale lips. Her eyes widened when she saw Steve. "You came back," she whispered, a tremulous smile spreading across her face. "I read the letter," Steve said simply, placing the fresh daisies next to the ones from yesterday. Catherine followed him in, looking between them with increasing confusion. "Mom, who is this?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Steve's face, as if seeking permission. He gave a small nod, his heart hammering in his chest. "Catherine," Elizabeth said, her voice quavering. "This is Steve Larson. He's your brother." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine stared at her mother, then at Steve, her face going through a rapid succession of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock. What?" She shook her head slightly, as if trying to clear it. "Mom, what are you talking about? I don't have a brother. Jen and I are your only children." Elizabeth reached for Catherine's hand. "Sit down, sweetheart. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you and your sister a long time ago." As Catherine slowly sank into the chair beside her mother's bed, Elizabeth began to tell the story once more. The young waitress, the married police officer, the pregnancy, the threats, the impossible choice. Steve stood by the window watching Catherine's face as she absorbed her mother's words. Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, her hand covering her mouth in horror as Elizabeth described the night Donald McCarthy had broken into her apartment and threatened her with a gun. "You never told us," Catherine whispered when Elizabeth finished. "All these years, and you never said a word." "Your father knew," Elizabeth admitted. "I told him before we got married. He understood why I couldn't speak of it, why it had to stay buried in the past. We agreed it was safer that way." Catherine turned to look at Steve, really seeing him now. "And you've known all this time? That you had sisters?" Steve shook his head. "I only found out yesterday when I met Elizabeth for the first time. I was adopted as a newborn. I never knew anything about my birth parents until 3 weeks ago, when I received a letter saying she wanted to meet me. This is a lot to process, Catherine said, her voice unsteady. She stood up suddenly. I need some air. Excuse me. She hurried from the room, leaving Steve and Elizabeth in silence. After a moment, Steve moved to follow her. Give her a minute, Elizabeth advised softly. This is a shock. She's always been the emotional one. Wears her heart on her sleeve. Norma is the pragmatic one. She'll have questions, want proof. Steve nodded, settling back against the windowsill. What did you tell Catherine about me before I arrived? Everything, Elizabeth said. I thought it would be easier if she heard it from me first, without you standing there. I wasn't sure you'd come back at all. I almost didn't, Steve admitted. But after I read your letter, he trailed off, unable to fully articulate how those decades-old words had affected him. The door opened, and Catherine reappeared, her eyes red, but her composure restored. She walked directly to Steve, studying his face intently. Your eyes, she said softly. They're Mom's exact shape. A small, sad smile flickered across her face. I have a brother. All this time. And I never knew. Steve felt something shift inside him, the beginning of a connection he'd never expected to find. Catherine turned to Elizabeth. Does Jen know yet? Elizabeth shook her head. I wanted to tell you first, in person. I'll call her tonight. Catherine looked back at Steve. She'll be here this weekend. She's flying in on Friday. She hesitated, then asked, Would you come back then, so we could all meet? Before Steve could answer, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced down to see a message from the hospital. Emergency case incoming. Dr. Patterson asking if you can assist with bypass surgery. I have to go, he said, looking between the two women. Emergency at the hospital. You're a doctor? Catherine asked, surprise evident in her voice. Cardiac surgeon, Steve confirmed, already reaching for his coat. As he headed for the door, Catherine called after him. Wait, will you come back Friday? To meet Norma. Steve paused, his hand on the doorknob. Looking back at these two women, one who had given him life and then given him up, the other a sister he never knew he had, he felt the weight of a decision that could change all their lives. I need to think about it, he said honestly. This is complicated. Of course, Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Here's my number. In case you decide. As Steve took the card, their fingers brushed, and Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Your hands, she whispered. They're exactly like our father's. Jerry's, I mean. The same long fingers. She looked up at him, tears threatening again. He would have loved to meet you. The simple statement hit Steve with unexpected force. How different would his life have been if Elizabeth had met Jerry Cleaver before she met Donald McCarthy? If he had grown up with these sisters, with a father who might have loved him. I'll think about Friday, he promised, then hurried out the door, the business card clutched in his hand like a lifeline to a family he was only beginning to discover. For 3 days, Steve immersed himself in work, performing back-to-back surgeries and attending to patients with an intensity that left his colleagues commenting on his focus. But beneath his professional exterior, his mind kept returning to Elizabeth and Catherine, to the revelation of sisters he'd never known, to the decision about Friday's meeting with Norma. Thursday evening, he sat at the kitchen island while Julia prepared dinner, Catherine's business card turning over and over in his fingers. You're going to wear that card out, Julia observed, sliding a cutting board of chopped vegetables into a wok. Steve sighed. I still don't know what to do. Yes, you do, Julia said gently. You're just afraid to admit it. She was right, as usual. The truth was, despite all his hesitation, Steve knew he would go back to Pinewood Nursing Home tomorrow. The pull of family, of blood connections he'd never known existed, was too strong to resist. What if Norma reacts badly? He asked. What if she doesn't want a half-brother showing up out of nowhere? Julia stirred the vegetables, the aromatic scents of garlic and ginger filling the kitchen. Then you'll handle it with the same grace you handle everything else. But from what you've told me about Catherine's reaction, I think you're worrying unnecessarily." Steve nodded, then pulled out his phone. He typed a message to the number on Catherine's card. "This is Steve. I'll be there tomorrow to meet Norma, if that's still okay." The response came almost immediately. "Thank you. Mom will be so happy. We both will. Jen arrives at 4. Come whenever you can after that." Later that night, as Steve checked on his sleeping sons before heading to bed, he found himself studying their faces with new awareness. Gregory had Julia's high cheekbones and full lips, while Jimmy had inherited Steve's prominent brow and wide-set eyes. Both boys had skin several shades lighter than their mother's and darker than his own, physical manifestations of their blended heritage. For the first time, Steve wondered if his own features might echo Donald McCarthy, the father he'd never known, and now never would. The man who, if Elizabeth's story was true, had been willing to kill his own unborn child rather than acknowledge him. The thought kept him awake long into the night. Friday afternoon arrived with unexpected speed. Steve's last patient of the day was an elderly man recovering from a valve replacement whose progress was so good that Steve was able to leave the hospital by 3:30. He stopped to buy daisies, now knowing they were indeed Elizabeth's favorite, and arrived at Pinewood just after 4:15. As he approached room 217, he heard women's voices, 3 of them now. He paused outside, taking a deep breath before knocking. Catherine opened the door, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Steve, you came." She stepped back, gesturing him in. "Come meet Norma." The woman sitting by Elizabeth's bed stood up as he entered. She was shorter than Catherine, with darker hair cut in a stylish bob and sharper features that reminded Steve of old photos he'd seen of Elizabeth when she was younger. Her expression was guarded but curious. "Norma, this is Steve," Catherine said, a hint of nervous excitement in her voice. Norma stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's nice to meet you," she said, her voice controlled, but not unfriendly. "This is quite a surprise." Steve shook her hand, noting her firm grip. "For me as well," he replied, offering a small smile. An awkward silence followed, broken by Elizabeth's thin voice from the bed. "You brought daisies again." "Thank you, Steve." He moved to place them in the vase with the previous bouquet, removing the wilted flowers. "How are you feeling today?" he asked Elizabeth. "Better, now that you're all here," she said, her eyes moving between her 3 children with a mix of wonder and trepidation. "I never thought I'd see this day." Norma returned to her chair, her posture rigid. "Mom's told me everything," she said to Steve. "About your father, about why she gave you up." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It's a lot to process." Catherine sat on the edge of Elizabeth's bed. "We've been talking about what happens next," she explained to Steve. "How we move forward from here." "If that's what you want," Norma added quickly, studying Steve's face. "We'd understand if you didn't want anything to do with us." Steve considered this as he took the remaining chair. Did he want a relationship with these newfound sisters? With the mother who had given him up? 3 weeks ago, he'd been certain he wanted nothing from Elizabeth except answers. Now he wasn't so sure. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted honestly. "But I'm here. That's a start." Norma nodded, something in her expression softening slightly. "Catherine tells me you're a cardiac surgeon. That's impressive. And you? What do you do?" Steve asked. "I'm an attorney, corporate law." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Catherine's the artistic one. She owns a gallery downtown." "Modern art," Catherine explained. "Small, but we're building a reputation." The conversation continued cautiously, each of them offering pieces of their lives like tentative gifts. Steve learned that Norma had 2 children, a boy and a girl, ages 8 and 6. Catherine was divorced, no children. Both had attended state universities on scholarships like Steve himself. As they talked, Steve found himself watching for similarities, for echoes of shared genetics. Norma had his same habit of tapping her fingers when thinking. Catherine laughed with her head thrown back, just as he did. Small things, but they resonated with unexpected power. Elizabeth mostly listened, her eyes moving between her children with quiet joy, occasionally offering a comment or clarification. But Steve noticed her growing more tired as the hour passed, her eyelids drooping despite her evident desire to stay engaged. "I think we should let Mom rest," Catherine said finally, noticing the same signs. Norma checked her watch. "I should call and check on the kids anyway. My husband's great with them, but he tends to let bedtime slide when I'm away." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth suddenly reached for Steve's hand. "Will you stay, just for a few minutes?" she asked. "There's something else I need to tell you. Something I haven't told the girls yet." Steve glanced at his sisters, who looked curious, but not concerned. "We'll wait in the lounge," Catherine offered. "Take your time." When they had gone, Elizabeth seemed to gather her strength, pushing herself more upright in the bed. "There's something I want to give you," she said, her voice low but urgent. "In my dresser drawer, the bottom one. There's a manila envelope." Steve retrieved it, feeling the weight of what seemed to be several items inside. "Open it," Elizabeth directed. Inside, Steve found a small bundle of photographs, a folded document, and a velvet jewelry box. He looked at Elizabeth questioningly. "The photos first," she said. Steve pulled them out, his breath catching as he looked at the top image. It showed a much younger Elizabeth, her belly swollen with pregnancy, her hand resting protectively over it. The next showed her in a hospital bed, holding a newborn with distinctly brown skin. Himself, he realized with a jolt. You kept these?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Elizabeth nodded. "The nurse took them before they took you away. I wasn't supposed to have any connection to you, but she saw how much I was hurting. She gave me copies secretly." Her eyes filled with tears. "Those are the only pictures I have of you until today." Steve flipped through the rest, some showing Elizabeth at different stages of pregnancy, one showing just his tiny newborn foot with the hospital bracelet around his ankle. The final photo made him pause. It showed a young black man in a police uniform, smiling confidently at the camera. "That's Donald," Elizabeth said quietly. "Your father. It was in the newspaper when he joined the force." Steve stared at the face of the man who had helped create him, then threatened his existence. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The same wide-set eyes, the strong jawline, the shape of the ears. For 40 years, Steve had wondered where his features had come from. Now, he knew. "The document," Elizabeth prompted. Steve unfolded it carefully. It was his original birth certificate, listing Elizabeth Cleaver as his mother and father unknown on the paternal line. His birth name was written as Baby Boy Cleaver. "I wasn't allowed to name you," Elizabeth explained. "Part of the closed adoption. But in my heart I called you David, after my grandfather." Steve swallowed hard, imagining a young Elizabeth saying goodbye to her David, never expecting to see him again. "And this?" he asked, picking up the jewelry box. Elizabeth's eyes softened. "That belonged to my grandmother. It's been passed down through the women in our family for generations. I always planned to give it to my daughter on her wedding day." She paused, her gaze steady on Steve. "But you were my firstborn. It should have been for your wife." Steve opened the box to find a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. He pressed the tiny clasp, and it opened to reveal a miniature photograph of a young woman in early 20th century dress. "My grandmother," Elizabeth said. "Your great-grandmother." She hesitated, then added, "I'd like Julia to have it if she would. And someday, perhaps your sons might give it to their wives." Steve closed the locket carefully, overcome by the gesture. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was an acknowledgement of his place in Elizabeth's family line, a tangible connection to a heritage he'd never known. "Why are you giving me these now?" he asked. "Why not show Catherine and Norma as well?" Elizabeth's expression grew serious. "Because these belong to you, not to them. They've always had their history, their place in the family. You were denied that." She reached for his hand again. "And because there's something else I need to tell you. Something I haven't told anyone else yet." Steve felt a chill at her tone. "What is it?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "The doctors did another scan yesterday. The cancer has spread to my brain." Her voice was remarkably steady. "They've changed my prognosis. It's no longer months, it's weeks, maybe days." Steve felt his doctor's instincts kicking in. "Have they adjusted your treatment plan?" "There are options for—" Elizabeth shook her head, cutting him off gently. "I've declined further treatment. I'm ready, Steve. I've made my peace." Her eyes held his, suddenly clear and determined. "But I needed to find you first. I needed to explain. And now I need to ask you something very important." Her grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength. "Will you help me tell your sisters? And after I'm gone, will you help them understand why I kept you a secret all these years?" Steve sat in the hospital chapel, the manila envelope from Elizabeth clutched in his hands, his mind racing. After promising to help tell Catherine and Norma about their mother's worsening condition, he had excused himself, needing a moment alone to process everything. The quiet space, with its simple wooden pews and stained glass windows casting colored light across the floor, offered no answers, but at least provided solitude. How had his life changed so dramatically in just 1 week? 7 days ago, Elizabeth Cleaver had been merely a name on a letter, the woman who had abandoned him. Now she was a dying mother who had given up her firstborn to protect him, who had carried his memory for 40 years, who was asking him to help his newfound sisters through her death. His phone vibrated with a text from Julia. "Everything okay?" He typed back. "Elizabeth's condition is worse than she told everyone. Days, not months. She wants me to help tell C and J." Julia's response came quickly. "What are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was he going to do? Not just about Elizabeth's request, but about these sisters, this sudden family that had appeared in his life. Did he want to be part of their lives after Elizabeth was gone? Did they want to be part of his? "I think I need to stay," he texted back. "At least until it's over." Julia's reply warmed him. "I understand. Do what you need to do. We're here when you need us. Love you." Steve tucked his phone away and stood up, decision made. He would help Elizabeth tell her daughters the truth. He would stay until the end. What came after that, they would figure out together. He found Catherine and Norma in the lounge, heads bent close together in conversation. They looked up when he entered, their expressions questioning. "Is everything okay?" Catherine asked. "Mom seemed like she had something important to tell you." Steve took a deep breath. "We need to talk. All of us together. There's something Elizabeth needs to tell you, but she asked for my help." The sisters exchanged concerned glances. "That sounds serious," Norma said, straightening in her chair. "It is," Steve confirmed, "but it should come from her." As they walked back to room 217, Catherine touched Steve's arm lightly. "Whatever it is, thank you for being here. I know it can't be easy for you. Any of it." Steve nodded, unexpectedly moved by her understanding. This woman who had been a stranger days ago was showing him more empathy than he might have expected from a lifetime acquaintance. Elizabeth was dozing when they returned to her room, but she awakened as they entered, her face brightening despite her evident fatigue. "You're all here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good." Steve positioned himself beside her bed, with Catherine and Norma sitting close by. "Elizabeth has something to tell you," he said gently. "Something important." Elizabeth reached for her daughter's hands, holding one in each of her frail grips. "My beautiful girls," she began, her voice strengthening with purpose. "There's something I haven't told you about my condition." As Elizabeth explained the latest prognosis, Steve watched Catherine and Norma's faces crumple with grief. Catherine began weeping openly, while Norma went very still, her jaw clenched as if physically holding back her emotion. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Norma asked, her voice tight. "I just found out yesterday," Elizabeth replied. "And I wanted us all to be together when I told you." Her eyes moved to include Steve. "All of us." "What can we do?" Catherine asked through her tears. "There must be something." Elizabeth shook her head gently. "I've made my decision. No more treatments. I want quality time with my children, not more painful procedures." She squeezed their hands. "I want to go home." "Home?" Norma repeated. "Mom, you need care. The nursing home has—" "I want to die in my own house," Elizabeth said firmly. "With my children around me. The hospice nurse can come there." Catherine and Norma looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. "If that's what you want, we'll make it happen," Norma said finally. "I'll extend my stay. We'll set up a hospital bed in the living room, like we did for Dad." "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, relief evident in her face. Then she turned to Steve. "Will you visit while I'm there?" Steve felt 3 pairs of eyes on him, waiting for his answer. He thought about his busy schedule at the hospital, about his family waiting at home, about all the complications this situation presented. But then he thought about Elizabeth's letter, written 40 years ago with such raw emotion, and the photographs she'd kept hidden all these years. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll visit." Over the next 2 weeks, Steve found himself drawn deeper into the Cleaver family. Elizabeth was moved to her small bungalow where Catherine and Norma set up a rotation of care, supplemented by daily hospice nurse visits. Steve stopped by every other day, sometimes bringing his wife and sons to meet the family they'd never known existed. During those visits, Steve watched as his sons cautiously bonded with their new aunts and cousins. Norma's children were delighted to discover teenage cousins who knew all about video games and sports, while Gregory and Jimmy seemed equally pleased to have younger relatives who looked up to them with admiration. Julia and Catherine hit it off immediately, discovering a shared love of art and literature. Even Norma, the most reserved of the group, gradually warmed to Julia's gentle humor and medical expertise, often consulting her about Elizabeth's medications and comfort. And through it all, Elizabeth watched from her bed in the living room, her eyes filled with wonder at the family that had assembled around her. A family that, until 3 weeks ago, had existed in 2 separate halves, neither knowing about the other. One evening, as Steve sat beside Elizabeth while the others prepared dinner in the kitchen, she reached for his hand. "You brought them flowers," she said softly, nodding toward the vase of daisies on her bedside table. "I know they're your favorite," Steve replied. "Do you know why?" When he shook his head, she continued, "When I was pregnant with you, I craved them, not to eat, just to look at. I'd walk to the corner store every day just to see the buckets of daisies outside." Her smile was wistful. "They reminded me of the sun, of hope." Steve squeezed her hand gently. "Elizabeth, can I ask you something?" "Anything. After all these years of keeping me a secret, why did you decide to find me now? Why not take the secret to your grave?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window where the evening light was fading. "I've asked myself that 1,000 times, she admitted. "Part of it was selfish. I wanted to see you, to know you were okay, to explain." She looked back at him. "But it was more than that. When I got the diagnosis, I started thinking about legacies, what I was leaving behind, and I realized I was leaving a broken family, one that didn't even know it was broken." She shifted slightly, wincing with pain before continuing. "Your sisters deserve to know they had a brother. You deserve to know you had sisters. Family is too precious to keep fractured when there's a chance to heal it." From the kitchen came the sound of laughter, Catherine and Julia by the sound of it. Then Jimmy's voice joined in, followed by Norma's son. "Listen to that," Elizabeth whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "That's my legacy now. Not secrets and separation, but connection. Family." Steve felt his own eyes growing damp. In just 3 weeks, his definition of family had expanded in ways he never could have imagined. The Larsons would always be his parents. They had raised him, loved him, shaped him into the man he had become. But now there were these other connections, these blood ties that, despite 40 years of absence, seemed to be growing stronger by the day. As the 2 weeks progressed, Elizabeth grew weaker. Her lucid periods became shorter, her sleep deeper and more frequent. Steve began stopping by every day, sometimes just for 15 minutes between surgeries, unwilling to miss any of the precious moments that remained. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Steve received a text from Catherine. "Mom's asking for you. Hospice says it's time. Please come if you can." He was in the middle of patient consultations, but his department head, understanding the situation, immediately arranged coverage. Within 30 minutes, Steve was pulling up outside Elizabeth's house, where Norma's husband met him at the door. "She's been asking for you," he said quietly, leading Steve to the living room. Elizabeth lay in the hospital bed, her breathing shallow, her skin ashen. Catherine and Norma sat on either side of her, each holding one of her hands. They looked up as Steve entered, relief evident on their tear-streaked faces. "Steve is here, Mom," Catherine said, leaning close to Elizabeth's ear. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, finding Steve with effort. A faint smile touched her lips as he approached the bed. "My son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." Steve took the spot Catherine vacated for him, gently taking Elizabeth's frail hand in his. "I'm here," he said softly. Elizabeth's gaze moved between her 3 children, a deep contentment settling over her features despite her obvious pain. "All my children," she murmured. "Together." Norma reached across the bed to take Steve's other hand, completing the circle. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Elizabeth's labored breathing and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. "I need to tell you," Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice unexpectedly clear. "Need you to know." "Save your strength, Mom," Norma urged gently. But Elizabeth shook her head slightly. "No time for that." Her eyes locked with Steve's. "I need you to know I loved you from the first moment. Never stopped." Steve felt tears spilling down his cheeks. "I know," he whispered. "I believe you." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to include all 3 of her children. "Promise me," she said, each word a visible effort. "Promise you'll stay together. Be a family." Catherine nodded through her tears. "We promise, Mom." "All of us," Norma added, squeezing Steve's hand. Elizabeth's eyes returned to Steve, a question in them, one final uncertainty. Steve took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the culmination of 40 years of separation and 3 weeks of discovery. He thought about all that had been lost. The childhood he might have had with these sisters, the relationship he might have had with Elizabeth. But he also thought about all that had been found. This unexpected connection, this new branch of family that had welcomed him despite the circumstances. "I promise," he said, his voice steady despite his tears. A look of profound peace settled over Elizabeth's face. She closed her eyes, her breathing growing more shallow. "My children," she whispered, so softly they had to lean close to hear. "My family. Complete at last." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. And inside, 3 siblings, strangers just weeks ago, held hands around their mother's bed, united by blood, by loss, and by a promise that would carry them forward together. 3 months after Elizabeth Cleaver was laid to rest in the small cemetery on the edge of town, Steve Larson stood before her headstone, a bouquet of fresh daisies in his hands. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath his feet as he bent to place the flowers beside the simple gray marker. Elizabeth Ann Cleaver, beloved mother, grandmother, friend, a family restored is life's greatest gift. The epitaph had been Steve's suggestion, a truth that had revealed itself in the weeks following Elizabeth's passing. As he straightened, he heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Catherine and Norma walking toward him, their arms linked against the October chill. "We thought we might find you here," Catherine said, giving him a warm hug. "Same time every week." Steve smiled, embracing Norma in turn. "Old habits. How are you both?" "Busy," Norma replied. The kids are neck-deep in school projects, and work is, well, work. And the gallery's hosting a new exhibition next week, Catherine added. You and Julia are coming, right? Opening night? Wouldn't miss it, Steve assured her. He had been surprised to discover how quickly these weekly rituals had formed, bringing flowers to Elizabeth's grave on Tuesdays, family dinners on Sunday afternoons, regular texts and calls throughout the week. The three siblings stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. It's been 3 months today, Norma said finally. Sometimes it feels like years and sometimes like yesterday. Steve nodded, understanding perfectly. The weeks following Elizabeth's death had been a blur of funeral arrangements, legal matters, and shared grief. But beneath the sorrow had been a growing foundation of connection. 3 adults discovering what it meant to be siblings later in life. Mom would be happy, Catherine said, glancing at the flowers Steve had brought. Seeing us together like this. She would, Steve agreed. Then checking his watch, he added, I should head back. I have a surgery scheduled for 2. We'll walk you to your car, Norma offered. As they made their way through the cemetery, Catherine asked, How's the research going? For the Children's Cardiac Center? Steve felt a surge of pride. The Elizabeth Cleaver Memorial Children's Cardiac Center had been his idea, a way to honor his birth mother, while also addressing a need he saw daily in his practice. Boston had excellent cardiac care for adults, but pediatric cases often required transfers to other facilities. The foundation approved the initial funding yesterday, he shared, and the hospital board is on board. We're looking at breaking ground next spring. That's wonderful, Norma exclaimed. Mom would have been so proud. At his car, they paused for goodbyes, confirming plans for Sunday dinner at Norma's house. As Steve drove away, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed in just a few months. The anger and hurt that had driven him to that first meeting with Elizabeth had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a sense of completion he hadn't known he was missing. At home that evening, Steve found Julia and the boys setting the table for dinner. Gregory was describing his college applications, while Jimmy argued the merits of his latest video game strategy. Perfect timing, Julia said, greeting him with a kiss. Dinner's just ready. How was your day? Good, Steve replied, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. I saw Catherine and Norma at the cemetery. Julia nodded, understanding the significance. And how was that? It was nice, actually. Peaceful. He dried his hands, turning to face his family. I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to talk to all of you about it. The boys looked up, curiosity evident in their expressions. What's up, Dad? Gregory asked. Steve took a deep breath. You know how Aunt Catherine and Aunt Norma have been going through Elizabeth's house, sorting things for donation? The boys nodded. In the month since Elizabeth's death, they had quickly adapted to having new aunts and cousins, accepting the expanded family with the easy flexibility of youth. They found some boxes in the attic, Steve continued. Photo albums, mostly. Pictures of Elizabeth when she was young, of her parents, your great-grandparents. He paused. And they found information about Donald McCarthy, my biological father. Julia came to stand beside him, her hand resting supportively on his back. What kind of information? She asked gently. Newspaper clippings mostly, his career, commendations. Steve shook his head slightly. Nothing personal. Nothing that explains why he did what he did. But enough to give me a clearer picture of who he was. Are you okay, Dad? Jimmy asked, concern evident in his voice. Steve smiled at his younger son. I am. Better than okay, actually. It's like finding the missing pieces of a puzzle I didn't realize was incomplete. As they sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed naturally to other topics, school, work, weekend plans. But later, after the boys had retreated to their rooms for homework, Steve and Julia sat together on the back deck, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. I got a call from the adoption agency today, Steve said quietly. They finally located the records of my placement with the Larsons. Julia turned to him, surprise in her eyes. After all this time? I thought those records were sealed. They were. But with Elizabeth's death and her formal acknowledgement of me in her will, they were able to release them. He took Julia's hand. There was a letter in the file, from the social worker who handled my case. What did it say? Steve looked up at the stars, remembering the words that had moved him to tears in his office that afternoon. She wrote about how Elizabeth refused to leave the hospital until she knew I had been placed with a good family. How she insisted on reviewing the Larsons' profile herself, even though that wasn't standard procedure for closed adoptions. How she cried when she signed the final papers, but kept saying she was doing the right thing to keep me safe. Julia squeezed his hand. She loved you from the beginning. She did, Steve agreed, his voice thick with emotion. And in her own way, she tried to protect me, even if it meant giving me up. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Julia spoke again. Have you thought more about what you're going to do with the items from Elizabeth's safety deposit box? The box had been another surprise, a small collection of items Elizabeth had kept separate from her other possessions. Inside had been a trust fund established in Steve's birth name, untouched for 40 years, several pieces of family jewelry, and a sealed letter addressed to Donald McCarthy or his surviving family. I'm not going to do anything with it, Steve said. Donald McCarthy is dead. His wife is dead. According to the obituary, they never had children. Whatever Elizabeth wanted to say to him, it doesn't matter anymore. You're not curious? Steve considered the question. Part of me is, but another part feels like that chapter is closed. Elizabeth found peace before she died. She brought her family together. That's what matters now. The following Sunday, the extended family gathered at Norma's house for their weekly dinner. The dining room table had been extended to its full length to accommodate everyone, Steve, Julia, and their sons, Norma, her husband, and their 2 children, Catherine and her new boyfriend, and the Larsons, Steve's adoptive parents, who had been included in these gatherings from the beginning. As dishes were passed and conversations flowed around the table, Steve found himself observing the scene with a sense of wonder. Here were the Larsons, who had raised him with love and support, chatting easily with Catherine about her gallery. Here were his sons, engaged in an animated discussion with Norma's children about a shared interest in astronomy. Here was Julia, laughing at a story Norma's husband was telling. And here he was, at the center of it all, a man who had once defined himself by the abandonment he'd experienced as an infant, now surrounded by an abundance of family and love. When everyone had eaten their fill, Steve tapped his glass for attention. As the conversations quieted, he stood, looking around at the faces turned expectantly toward him. I want to thank you all for being here, he began. These Sunday dinners have become something I look forward to all week. Murmurs of agreement circled the table. 3 months ago, we gathered for Elizabeth's funeral. None of us knew exactly what would happen next. If these new connections would last. If we could truly become a family after so many years apart. He paused, his gaze moving to the Larsons. Some of you have been my family all my life. Some of you are newer additions, but all of you are precious to me. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, the one Elizabeth had given him in the nursing home. Elizabeth left me this family heirloom. It's a locket that has been passed down through generations of Cleaver women. He opened the box, revealing the delicate gold piece. Inside is a picture of our great-grandmother. Catherine and Norma exchanged surprised glances. Originally, Elizabeth wanted me to give this to Julia, Steve continued. But Julia and I have been talking, and we have a different idea. He turned to Gregory. Son, your girlfriend Sarah has become an important part of this family. When the time is right, and I'm not saying that needs to be soon, this brought laughter from around the table. We'd like you to have this for her. Gregory's eyes widened as Steve handed him the box. Dad, are you sure? This is a family heirloom. That's exactly why I'm sure, Steve replied. Because we are all family now. Connected by blood, by choice, by love. He raised his glass. To family, found, restored, and cherished. As glasses clinked around the table, Steve caught Catherine wiping away a tear. Norma reached across to squeeze his hand, and from the head of the table, Mrs. Larson, the woman who had raised him as her own for 40 years, gave him a nod of profound approval and love. Later, as they were leaving, Norma pulled Steve aside. "I found something else in Mom's things yesterday," she said, pressing a small, worn photograph into his hand. "I thought you should have it." Steve looked down to see a hospital room, a much younger Elizabeth holding a newborn baby to her chest, her expression a mix of love and heartbreak. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "My David, my firstborn. May you find the love you deserve." And in that moment, standing in the doorway with his newfound sister, the photo of his birth mother in his hand, and the sounds of his extended family chatting happily behind him, Steve Larson knew with absolute certainty that he had. If you stayed until the end, thank you. I hope this story touched something in you, because it tore something open in me. If you believe in second chances, if you've ever waited for an apology that never came, you're not alone. Consider subscribing, and I'll meet you in the next